Okay. I saw some, so I had to say something. I can't play this movie because it has a lot of sound to it. And my reaction to it was offline. But I wanted to give my own commentary on this movie called The American Society of Magical Negroes. Um, the dislike button has been disabled for a reason for people like me who disagree with material like this. Now, David Allen Greer, I like some of his work, and the guy on the left, I actually liked him. I don't know his name, but I liked him in Dungeons and Dragons. He was a sorcerer who wasn't a good sorcerer. Like when I mean good, I mean he couldn't master his sorcery, but he eventually elevated his sorcery in Dungeons and Dragons. But this movie, The American Society of Magical Negroes, is a disgrace. But I'll play devil's advocate by mentioning the 2/3 of our people that are under mind control, and that are subjecting themselves to white supremacy throughout throughout their lifetime. Movies like this are they only add to the division within so-called blacks. For the most part, so-called blacks, when it comes to so-called blacks, for the most part, a larger number of so-called blacks are what are considered converts, Christian religious converts, and they worship the sources that so-called whites provide them with, whether it's through agencies, through the state, through programs, through religion. Most blacks, the majority of so-called blacks, outnumber the minority, of course. But there's a remnant of blacks, so-called blacks, that do not subscribe to paganism, who understands that God doesn't love all people, including so-called whites. And so-called whites have a terrible history of murder, deception, lies, trickery, colonization, savagery, rape, slavery, pillaging, sodomy, cannibalism. Okay? And for the most part, the majority of so-called blacks are dumb, deaf, and blind. Some of them by choice, and the others are by default because they were conditioned from a child by gynarchy and false teachings. The mind control is real that so-called paganism and white survivalism has over the minds of the majority of so-called blacks. White survivalism will come at the cost of families, so-called black families, the destruction of so-called black families that'll come at the cost of children, men, and women. White survivalism is what I constantly see. It's white supremacy and white survivalism. Movies like this, Magical Negro movie, are about a group of Negroes that cater to white survivalism. And if repeating history, I think the name of this movie should have been called Repeating History. Negroes repeating history. Because if you don't, these Negroes in America do not want to separate from so-called whites, which are their enemy. For several reasons, they're the enemy. First of all, white survivalism doesn't have so-called blacks' best interest in their hearts, which is their minds. Every movie is either about white survivalism or feminism. Now, feminism comes like in the form of a new Marvel movie with the female superheroes, which sucks, like the WNBA. I like the male depicted heroes. I like the male Marvel heroes. I like all the male roles, not the female roles. That's when the movie doesn't get any airplay in my household, and I don't give it any attention. Once I see that there's females portraying themselves as heroes. But if you haven't seen the trailer for this Magical Negro, the American Society of Magical Negroes, go check it out for yourself. You may fall on the side of white survivalism. You may think that God loves everybody and all of this, all of that deception stuff that religion pushes. Or you may agree that this movie is continuing a slave and a master history. It's repeating history. For me, it's repeating history. It's an upscale or modern day upgraded version of house niggas becoming, putting themselves back in slavery, which is not chattel slavery, but mental and spiritual slavery. Keeping you all in that sunken place, you so-called sellouts and coons and house niggas, whatever we refer to you as. But I believe that the majority of black people keep the minority of black people in this repetitive cycle of like a lapdog, in this repetitive cycle of mental slavery. Like I said, the majority of modern day black people do not want to separate from their enemy. So here in this scene, you have Dave Allen Greer speaking to this other fella, and he's basically showing him the ropes of how this Negro society of magical Negroes conducts themselves, and he's explaining to him how this goes, how that society works. So he says that keeping white people that feel uncomfortable have bad consequences for so-called blacks. Making so-called whites, which are Edomites, uncomfortable has terrible negative consequences for so-called blacks. I forget how he words it, but it's in a roundabout way. That's how he puts it. Okay, so that type of tutelage and is what keeps the minds of so-called blacks in slavery. Like I said, these Negroes will be totally okay with chattel slavery coming back in play. I don't believe blacks um, see white survivalism as a threat and constantly supporting white survivalism as a threat. Most of these movies are about white survivalism. I'm not talking about the crime movies. I'm talking about like your action movies, your science fiction movies. Most of them are about white survivalism. Um, you know, your Avengers and your Guardians of the Galaxy type movies, and those movies. Same thing with Avatar. All of these are white survivalist movies. We can call them colonizers, colonization movies, because they even colonize planets. They colonize indigenous cultures in those movies. All white survivalist movies are pretty much colonizing movies. Um, Avatar was a colonizing movie. It was the U.S. Marines invading an indigenous people for this resource. Um, and then part two of Avatar, I didn't see that movie, but I noticed that the so-called white man that was paralyzed, that was being used to infiltrate the avatars, he wound it up somehow marrying this woman and having a child by this woman in this artificial world. And then the part two had more guns because of so-called whites, which are the Edomites, had an influence and had infiltrated the Avatar race, and then there was no more peace with the Avatars. The Avatars lost their indigenous status pretty much to these so-called whites invading them, and then you had this white survivalist movie all over again. So we see how these movies always end up being about white survivalism. And so-called blacks and Latinos and Native Indians have no problem working alongside so-called whites and depicting this white survivalist, this constant ending or constant narrative with white survivalism being the point, being what the movie's constantly about. It's about white survivalism. We could say white supremacy, but white supremacy movies reminded me were like the movie Roots, Goodbye Uncle Tom. Those were colonial movies, straight up slavery movies. But when you get into the white survivalist movies, they try to make them action packed. They try to make it as if there's a rainbow of races working together for white survivalism, and they make it seem as if all races desire the same outcome, which is white survivalism, white rulership. Okay, the rules are set by the so-called whites in all of these white survivalist movies. You don't see no other race being the dominant race. You see whites, so-called whites, are the dominant race. They don't. Whites have this thing about not following behind no other race. They have this thing about if they're going to be involved, then the language is going to be spoken. Their language is going to be what's spoken. Their rules are going to be what's keeping everyone in check. their policies, their codes, their survivalism. Okay, we see it with all of the movies. Like Prometheus. Um, we whites, these Edomites and so-called whites, they have a thing about um, trying to make their reason everybody's reason, trying to convince, whether by force or by choice, but it's usually by force. If they can't convince all people to get down or to get on board with what their intentions are, then they'll just get rid of people that don't want to support their survivalism. And to me, so-called blacks play a high role in assisting in this narrative, because all these so-called blacks have to do is relinquish their own culture and race and values, and then trade their values in for so-called whites' values. And then you have this melanated European, this melanated Caucasian, this melanated Edomite. Um, you can see it with police officers. You can see it with, um, you know, these Negroes working alongside these whites for the same cause. And so-called whites will never do that for so-called blacks. They'll never fight alongside so-called blacks for their liberation, for the liberation of so-called blacks. You would never you would never see so-called whites uplifting the heritage of so-called blacks, as far as wanting so-called blacks to be free and sovereign and separated, without it being about race and making it racial. Separating from whites is not it's not racial. It's for the betterment of so-called blacks. It's for the betterment of us as a people. It's not about, it doesn't have to be about race when so-called whites work well together and set up a rulership and have currency and trade and all of this stuff. It doesn't have to be about race. Like, it doesn't have to be about racism, keeping us from things and stuff like that. It doesn't have to be about that. When they work together, it's not always about race. It's just about their survival. And I believe so-called blacks need to separate and be more concerned with their own survival, instead of attaching themselves to the source that whites, so-called whites, provide for them, which is like the banking system and jobs. Okay. To me, so-called blacks have lost their way. They've lost their value system. They threw it away. These are the same ones who won't keep the commandments of the Bible, and they believe that you can't keep the commandments because they threw them away within their own life. So I can't play this movie, like I said, because it has music involved. But if you want to go check out the trailer yourself, you know, and see it for yourself, how much of a disgrace, in my personal viewpoint, it is. But I wanted to get into a couple of these scriptures and definitions. So, to me, the source that so-called blacks attach themselves to is jobs and money, and of course the values of so-called whites. So the money of whites, the values of whites, and their money. You know what I'm saying? Money, their values, and you know, and I mean their religions. These jobs. The so-called black woman believes that a job replaces a man, and she doesn't want to share her she doesn't want to share her finances with her relationship. She doesn't want to contribute. She doesn't want to learn her place so she can serve her purpose, her divine purpose. She wants a traditional man while she's non-traditional. She, she doesn't believe in gender roles. At the same time, she doesn't want to. She doesn't want her finances to cover all expenses since there are no gender roles. So she wants this traditional man, but she doesn't want to. She thinks her role is conditional, and is usually based on money and resources, things that she can strip a man of. So you have this value system of the so-called whites that that so-called most so-called blacks subscribe to. The thing, the paganism, the holidays of man. So I think so-called black women are the biggest or have the biggest problem when it comes to selling out and subscribing to the ways of man. They do it so casually and nonchalantly, and they don't see the wrong in it. They would have to come back to the laws of God to see anything wrong with it. You can't really, you can't. I wouldn't expect so-called blacks to see anything wrong unless they come back to the laws. Just like I think that was Paul. Just like Paul said that he didn't know any wrong until he learned the laws of God, and then he saw the wrong in the world. So until these so-called blacks come back to the commandments of God, they will never see anything wrong with what they do and how they're brought up by within the values of so-called whites. So I believe the so-called blacks are married to the money and the jobs and the values of so-called whites. I believe they've already married it and committed to it. This is how they make decisions. This is how they view life through the eyes of so-called whites. And I believe somewhere throughout history, identifying with white values and identifying with white survivalism was taught to these so-called Negroes by some Negroes that they were related to. Could have been their grandmothers, could have been their mothers, could have been the women. But I just don't see a history of men teaching this without some sort of religious attachment or some sort of female attachment or some sort of value system of whites. That wasn't so-called blacks' priority to teach their people to identify with white, so-called whites' value systems, so-called whites' religion, so-called whites' deities and idols, religious idols and religious deities. Somewhere along history that showed up, and it became a part of the upbringing of so-called black children. I didn't get that lesson. My people were not sellouts, coons, and converts, and all of that kind of stuff. We didn't celebrate paganism and stuff like that. We didn't celebrate birthdays or pagan holidays either. So I don't have that issue with paganism. I didn't have to unsubscribe from paganism. I was never a part of that. But the Most High in Jeremiah 4:22, he says that for my people is foolish, and so-called blacks are foolish. At this point, they're foolish on their own. They're foolish. They're foolish by themselves, like they're on autopilot. And I believe that so-called whites who dominate in survivalism are pointing this out, and they're making it like an institution of some sort, because that's what the American that's what the American Society of Magical Negroes, the American part of their title means that their values are based on white survivalism. So the American society, why isn't it just called the Society of Magical Negroes? Why do they have to be American? So the American part means the values, you know, the value systems of so-called whites is is what the foundation of the society is based on. The Society of Magical Negroes foundation is based on white survivalism. It's like the Men in Black were put in place to hide the fact that there was aliens, and they would monitor extraterrestrial beings without the public being aware of it. But they didn't call themselves the American Men in Black. They were just the Men in Black. But this Society of Magical Negroes is starting off saying the title is the American Society of Magical Negroes. That's like somebody saying there's a black school down the street, and then you go down there and find out that the curriculum is European based, so-called white based, Edomite based. So it's not a black school, a so-called black school, or a Negro school, or a Negro college, because these Negro colleges have a so-called European Edomite curriculum put in place. They're going to teach these children that they're Greeks and all this stuff. And they're going to be walking across the burning sands, same symbolism that was, that comes from the Edomites being kicked out of the homeland. So this burning sand thing with these fraternities being taught in this so-called black school, but like I said, the curriculums are white, so-called white. So that American, the first part of this the Society of Magical Negroes is the American. So these are a bunch of like house niggas whose priority is white survivalism. They have magic, but they're not magical to the point where they want to separate from so-called whites. They're actually commissioned by so-called whites to control the minds of so-called blacks in a so-called white society, to guarantee the followership of so-called blacks, and not have a Messiah rise up with his magic. I bet you if they were using their magic to separate, I bet you the society would be shut down by some special agency. I bet you that. You so-called blacks, I hate y'all. I hate black people because of your values. They're not godly. Your values are of man. I hate you because your ways are of man. I hate you because your thought process is of man, or of feminism, or of gynarchy. Okay, you think like your mamas who didn't like your daddies. Y'all make decisions like women make decisions. Y'all think like women. Y'all think it's okay for a man to be abused and murdered and beat up, but y'all don't have no smoke for females that are wicked. Y'all take sides with white survivalism. Y'all take sides with gynarchy. I hate y'all because y'all celebrate paganism, and y'all still haven't figured out that religion was the tool used on our people to enslave us, not the Bible. I hate y'all because y'all are ignorant, And y'all like it like that? And then y'all make movies like this. Y'all are basically America's lapdogs. Your women with their toxic image, their toxic children, their toxic behavior of your so-called black women. Your women are trash. They're not wives. They're unmarriageable. They don't like to be women. They don't like their place as women. They're all about scams and schemes and being prostitutes and whores. And you men laugh at everything as a joke with you men because y'all are fornicators, just like y'all women. Yeah, everything is a joke when it comes to being serious and when it comes down to you all being men. And when it comes down to y'all women, everything is a joke. Instead of you all being an authoritative figure and being able to correct these situations, y'all make light of it. Y'all laugh. Everything is funny to y'all. If it's not about drugs and, being suckers over sex, y'all are nowhere to be found as men. And then when we do see some type of man, this man is just another sellout. He's been bought and paid for to continue the narrative that we, as men, are nothing more than good lapdogs. You could train us to be lapdogs. You could train us to go get some more so-called blacks that they can control as well. Just for the survivalism of so-called whites, and for the downfall of so-called blacks and their households. So-called black men think everything is a joke, and so-called black women are fine. They have no smoke for these men that don't want to be men. These men that are okay with allowing her to be toxic, allowing her to be out of order and unstable. These are the type of men that don't want to see anything harmful done to women, but when it comes to the men, he deserves it. He shouldn't say that he shouldn't say certain things to women. He shouldn't do these things to so-called whites and all of this stuff. The so-called American black man is a sellout. One thing that you so-called magical Negroes need to do is separate yourself from your enemies, like Ecclesiastes 6:13 says. Separate thyself from thine enemies and take heed of thy friends. Okay, so so-called whites are not your friends. You've been told and you've been warned already. So when things start happening, when bad things start happening, and the Most High sends a death angel your way because you haven't taken heed to these instructions and to these laws, statutes, and commandments, people like me have no sympathy. I like to see judgment take place on all and whosoever it falls on. That's judgment. Okay. So I don't wanna keep going on and rambling. But this is Jeremiah 4:22. For my people is foolish, they have not known me. They are sottish. Sottish means stupid. They are sottish children, and they have none understanding, which so-called blacks don't. The women don't know how to be wives, and the men don't know how to choose a woman as a wife. The men are fornicators. They don't want to enforce the laws of God like they're supposed to. The men are a bunch of converts, sellouts, and their source is money. That's what everybody walked away from the Most High for, just like Judas, for some shekels and labor, paid labor. Have none understanding. They are wise to do evil. But they don't know the difference, and they won't know evil. So-called blacks won't know evil until they learn the laws of God. Then that's the only place they have a problem with. They have a problem with whoever points out the wrong. So that's going to be someone righteous. Because we're talking about what's wrong with you, not what's wrong with how you get along with so-called whites. Those two separate schools of thought. And we have too many so-called blacks that come from the school of thought of white survivalism. If all you do is think about not making whites uncomfortable, then you're evil. Okay, because you're not keeping the laws of God. You're too worried about another people when you need to be worried about yourself and your people. They are wise to do evil, but to do good they have no knowledge. And so-called blacks don't want no knowledge. They think they're Africans. They think they're Africans and Americans, and you're not an American. I'm not black. I'm an Israelite. I'm not an American. I'm an Israelite. I don't support paganism. I don't practice paganism. I don't keep up with white survivalism. I don't give a damn about white survivalism. That's why I said I don't want to hear so-called black women say nothing about God or Jesus. I don't want to hear them say nothing about they need to shut the hell up about God and Jesus. Stop trying to take after men. The only thing you can do is keep the laws, statutes, and commandments. But stop trying to copy the men and learn about the women that were keeping the laws and be more like the women that were keeping the laws. That's what y'all can talk about. But this deity, Jesus, and this false God that they're talking about is not my God. I don't know who they're talking about. Religion's God is Satan. That's the only God they worship. That's the only God that so-called whites would ever teach about. The one that doesn't keep the law, statutes, and commandments of the Creator. So, these so-called blacks are too busy worshiping the creature and not the Creator. So that's my biggest problem with the majority of so-called blacks, is they're too focused on white survivalism and how they can contribute to that. Whether it's their jobs now, this is their work. Like I said, David Allen Greer, I like his work. I like a few things of his work, But this is one of those movies that I don't like. When they keep so-called blacks as lapdogs and house niggas in their sunken place. These are the types of blacks that so-called whites like to have around them. These Negroes who want to be, servants. Not these Negroes who are a threat. Like the Negroes who want their sovereignty, or the Negroes who don't give a damn about them. Okay? Because I don't give a damn about so-called whites. I respect them, but I don't like them. I don't give a damn about so-called whites. Not about to try to marry their daughters. Not about to try to have dinner with them. No. I hardly want to do business with them. So this this, hopefully this has been edifying for somebody who's listening. This is not hate. This is just edification. But what I don't like and what I do hate is the narrative that we are blacks as Israelites, and I hate the narrative that we are Americans. I hate the narrative that it's all about that so-called blacks need to be more concerned with white survivalism and the source of money instead of separating yourself from your enemies like your God told you to. Okay? And worry about yourself. All right? Because so-called whites have done an A-plus job with controlling the minds of these blacks, these so-called blacks who prioritize themselves with white survivalism. They've caught on to that. So-called whites have really caught on to the fact that these so-called blacks are more concerned with white survivalism, and they're more concerned with keeping white people happy instead of making them feel uncomfortable. That's why they come out with movies like this. That's why they come out with movies like this. And then you have men teaching other men, teaching another man's sons that it's all about white survivalism. These agents that pop up and convert another man's child. So you have strangers talking to other men's children. You have strangers dealing with men's children. You have women, black women with men's children, teaching them paganism and converting them. Got them at stores buying things, buying paganism stuff. The women do it so casually. The women are, like I said, I believe the so-called black woman is the second biggest problem and that the so-called black man has. Sometimes she tries to compete and be with the first. She wants to be the black man's first problem because she controls the minds of his children, and she'll fight tooth and nail to have those children, to teach them to be a bad influence to those children. She'll fight tooth and nail to be a bad influence, teaching them paganism, teaching them religion, So we could talk about white survivalism, and then we could talk about these so-called black women that are the threat after white survivalism. White survivalism would be like the studio, and then the so-called black woman and the black community's problem being a black woman. The number one problem for the black community is the black woman. She'll be right after white survivalism because she fights tooth and nail to teach the values of white survivalism to her children or to the black man's children, so-called black man's children. So she doesn't teach the children academics. She teaches the children paganism. She's a bad influence. She doesn't teach them science and math and stuff like that. She doesn't do that. She teaches the children birthdays, holidays, paganism, religion. She's to call it, idolatry, calling Jesus God and all of that stuff. And she's not practicing how to be a wife. She's not marriageable and stuff like that. She's a bad influence on the children and the households and the men. That's what I see. So I think I went on enough about this, but if you haven't seen this trailer, go check it out for yourself. If you a convert, a sellout, a two-third, if you love white people and you all about white survivalism, this is one of your movies. You know what I'm saying? If you divine and you still indigenous minded and you're keeping the laws of God or the Most High Yahweh, then this ain't your movie. This is probably some content for you to commentate about and edify somebody about these foolish, sottish Negroes, these American Negroes, these melanated Europeans, these gynarchy Negroes, these sellout Negroes. So that's my thoughts. Shalom.